Hi, I'm Jim Rosenthal. Welcome to Eye on Art. We're here today in Middlefield, Massachusetts with sculptor Andrew DeVries. Andrew, thank you for having us out here.
Thank you for coming.
I was reading your bio and I'm struck by the fact that you're actually someone who came off the farm and made it big.
That's true, which is a rarity. And you know, the farm was great training. The farm taught me how to use my hands, how to build things, the discipline that you need in order to be an artist. It also is self-employment, which is what making a living as an artist is about. You have to have the vision, but you also have to be grounded to a degree, and that was the farm training, and the long hours that it takes.
Also, I guess that you're self-reliant. If you're not depending on anybody else, if you don't do it yourself, it's not going to get done.
If you want it done, then yeah, you have to do it. I think that was one of the things about learning foundry for me, is that knowing that I can take a work all the way through, and just having that knowledge, and you couple it with determination, and you can achieve a lot. You can achieve a lot in a lifetime.
Let's talk a little bit more, though, about your formative years. And I noticed that you dropped out of high school and you're a self-taught artist.
Yeah, I dropped out when I was 15. I told my dad I was going to work with him for 5 years, which I did. At that time, I thought I was going to be a painter. I love the Impressionist era, Monet, Renoir, Degas in particular. And basically when I was 20 years old, I loaded everything in my pickup, my art supplies, my brushes, all the art books, and then took off. And I went west. Being from a farm, I felt comfortable going west as opposed to going into, a big urban area like New York City. I originally went from city to city to city, and I would draw in the art museums. I really took to heart other artists, their words saying to learn from the old masters. I ended up in Denver. I was in a restaurant, and the waitress happened to be a ballet dancer. And it had always been my dream to draw in a ballet studio like Degas, and that's what happened for the next 2 years. I drew in the company, it's Ballet Denver. Rika Marie Love is the artistic director and choreographer. It was her advice, actually, that led me to sculptures. I'd been struggling with painting, and even to this day, I never can really feel like I'm grabbing it. That's always my words, actually putting my hands on it. And she said, I think you should try sculpture. And I did at a small community school. And when I got clay in my hands, it really was what Joseph Campbell talks about, epiphany, that you really know why you were put on earth. It was one of those moments, and I can still feel the chill up my back.
So were you still in Denver at this point? Or?
I was still in Denver. I was in Denver from 78 to 84. The first 2 years I did nothing but draw in the ballet studio. And then after I started working in clay, it led very quickly to a mold making class, a foundry class, an apprenticeship with a sculptor who had a foundry. And then after that 6 months of apprenticeship, I was working in my own studio and working with friends who had foundry, another friend who had taught me mold making. And then in 84, I went to Europe to see all those things that I'd always seen in books. Even to this day, we talked a little bit before about going back to France. Books are a great thing, and movies and films of artwork, but to actually see a work in front of you, there's a transmission, I feel, sort of an osmosis between what a sculptor or painter did thousands of years ago that transfers an understanding, especially in sculpture. It's not, when you think about sculpture, it means 360 degrees. And
I guess
they're
you can only get that if you're there walking around and...
walking around it, seeing how the light changes it. And I tell people this, when they come out here to the studio or at the museum. You look at a work at all different times of day, early dusk, full sunlight from up above, a piece that's placed in the shade under a tree. All these things make a difference. And it's not so much that the sculptor has specifically, tried to get a feeling from, say, raindrops, but it happens. That's one of the great beauties about sculpture. It has, as compared to painting, where I always feel you have to go into a painting. Sculpture, the life radiates around it. So that's a big difference between the two mediums.
I was lucky to get to the Rodin Museum late last summer, and I know what you mean. A lot of his big works are outdoors on the ground.
Yeah. Yep.
And we were there in the late afternoon, and it was drizzling for a while, and although a lot of people went inside to avoid the rain, it was very interesting to see the works get wet and then the sun come out afterwards, and that gave it a completely different light.
Yeah, that feel. Even that little bit of moisture on the surface of the sculpture, the light, the refractory qualities will make it sing in a way that, in just a singular, straight, dead-on light won't. It's amazing how all these things go into the third dimension. It's like people, seeing people.
Yeah. So, how long were you in Europe at that time?
I was in Europe. I traveled with my wife for 2 months, and then she went back to her job in Denver, and I went into the Paris American Academy in Paris, a small art academy. So I was there for 7 months, came back in the spring of '85. We had already decided not to live in Denver. So after she finished, she had a couple months to finish up her job, and we once again packed everything up. My folks live in Rochester, south of Rochester, New York. So I brought a big truck out first and stored the things at their place, and then we just got in the van and headed east. Traveled, through Massachusetts, up to New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont. We really liked Northampton a lot. This was back in '85, and we traveled. I was looking for a studio actually, and there was a little real estate guide, and the Cutlery building had just started at that time. There were some art studios, but it also had listing for the place where we ended up for 10 years here across the field. It was a beat-up old camp. Once again, farm training. I could fix anything. It needed a lot of things. It needed plumbing. It had a hole about like that in the kitchen. So it had no insulation. So basically, we made it livable for 10 years. And then in '86, '87, my dad and I built the foundry. And I built the foundry equipment, and I started pouring metal, and then we're off and running.
You were mentioning that you were influenced to go into sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And what made you, or what interested you about bronze as opposed to marble or other media?
Well, there's a difference between a modeler and a carver. I, by nature, am a modeler. I take clay and I put it in my hands or wax. That's the most natural thing for me, and it's an additive process as opposed to a carver, being a subtractive process. The other big thing is what I see as my sculpture. Often my sculpture is perhaps a dancer on point or an abstract piece that comes off, once again, from a very small point going up and up and out. Bronze has the tensile strength to do that. You can also achieve all the way through different effects. It's much more, it reflects light as opposed to marble, say, which absorbs light. So you have to think about that, excuse me, in your work. The patina effects you can achieve, the different chemicals, which will make a piece do this or that, changing in color. So in a way you have, they don't act as paints because they're a chemical process. You don't control them like a paint. But through your knowledge you can give them color and lean a work specifically back to that vision that you have in your mind's eye. Basically the things I see, we've talked about this before, in my mind, that's how I create. They're all done, and bronze seems to be the medium. Now I've seen work in marble in my head, but at the moment, having set up the foundry, and it's a big expense. There's a lot of time and effort, money, equipment that goes into keeping the foundry going on the business side of things. And so you have to sort of say, well, maybe someday I'll carve again, because I haven't carved since my Denver days.
Why don't you take our viewers through the basic start to finish?
No, you're going to put this in with the Chesterwood stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, the beginning for me is I do a little sketch to capture that image that is in my mind's eye, and you can see sketches around the studio hanging up here and there, and a lot of notebooks. I have thousands of sketches that could become sculptures, but that image is what it's captured in what I call my shorthand, much different than my drawings. So I can go back to it. Then from there, I have to build an armature, and you'll see different armatures once again around the studio. These are works that are going to be coming up in the next year or two. That armature achieves it holds the weight and the mass of your modeling medium. That's what you're fighting as a sculptor.
Which would usually be clay, so...
Yeah, clay or wax, or plastiline, non-drying clay. And then from that point, once you've modeled your piece, you then have to make a rubber mold on it. And from the rubber mold, you'll get your wax casting. And then from the wax casting, you make a second mold on it. This is going very quickly. That second mold is ceramic shell material. The trick on that second mold is you're now making a mold on the outside and on the inside at the same time, so you're making a mold on the thickness of the wax. You then melt the wax out, and you pour your bronze into it. That ceramic shell mold is destroyed. So, you've made your ceramic shell mold. You then have to get the wax out. You put it into a high temperature oven and we're talking about temperatures around 2,000 degrees. Within 15 seconds, the wax is dripping out. In 20 minutes, it's burnt clean. And it is, when you pour this glowing pot of metal, it's a very intense moment. It's a very direct moment. And I always tell people there's no lying. You have to be true at that moment. You've either given everything your all, or it's not going to work.
When I went out to Chesterwood and watched your demonstration, you really had to plan ahead in terms of just how would you technically achieve the different final product that you want.
Right, that's true. A lot of that, my knowledge as a founder, it's just, I've been doing it as long as I've been sculpting. So I can, by that knowledge, take bronze and push it one step beyond what it normally would do. And that part of the artisanry in bronze is important to me.
What would be one of the examples where you pushed bronze beyond what you would normally expect it could take?
The piece is sold out in the edition, but the one that a lot of people just were amazed by was a piece called Innocence, and it was a woman floating horizontally, and the only point of contact to the base was off the back of the head through the hair. That was only achieved by the fact that I really am a good founder. I cast very light metal, and so I knew that I could push it that far. The chariot, too, back here, off those two little points, you've got 60 pounds of metal on these 2 points that are no larger than a half an inch. Once again, a light casting, controlling your metal, and knowing where the tensile strength point is. So
I did see your demonstration out at Chesterwood, and you're an artist in residence there. Daniel Chester French was also from this area. Do you see any parallels between yourself and...
Yeah, I do. I see both parallels and I see differences. When you have to think of Daniel Chester French as being trained in a neoclassical tradition, going to Italy and studying. Most American sculptors, that's what they did at that time. You either went to Italy or you went to France. He went to Italy, trained in that tradition, and was very successful, amazingly successful. And so I see myself as, we've talked about before, the link in the chain. We're all links in the chain. If you think about sculpture as being a language, and we all use the human form being the English language, and yet we develop our own dialect. Daniel Chester French worked mostly in public monuments, an amazing amount, 135 or something like that, a tremendous amount of work. That's not how I work. My work is really done on spec. I see the image, and I will do it, and hopefully somebody will buy it, and they always have. That doesn't seem to be the problem. But you can see the differences if you think of Brancusi. Brancusi, he only had one public monument in his life. Even Rodin did not have that many public monuments. Most of his work was done either portraiture that was commissioned or pieces that came out of the Gates of Hell. And they were individual pieces that evolved. There were only 4, 5 public monuments. And his Balzac was rejected. And the Gates of Hell, it was never cast in his lifetime. He finally had to buy it back, basically, from the state of France. But it was his great oeuvre of images that all came out of that work.
Was that cast after he died?
Yeah, it was cast after he died. And Rodin never cast his work. Rodin never cast his bronzes. That was always done by a founder. Rodin usually worked, up to about half-life, and then handed it on to his assistants, who then made it larger. And he would come, just like Daniel Chester French, would come and do the final work. It really is more of a studio system, that system, as opposed to what I do, where I, once again, like Brancusi, who take it all the way through. It does limit you, just the time does limit you. because you're not, letting this person do that and that person do that. You're taking it through all yourself, but it does, in a way, give the person who purchases the work or views the work a more direct connection to the sculptor. You can have no greater advocate for you than a sculptor sitting in somebody's house or sitting in front of some building. That, in the end, is what makes a legacy for a sculptor. So often what you see is that a critic is going to say this, is going to say that about a work of art or an artist's total work. This goes back to my wanting always to see what the artist said about his work. How important the artist's words are. You don't have to be reinterpreted while a person is alive or if somebody's written. I think about writing a book because I would like to have my words in it as opposed to somebody interpreting it. Because they can come up with some really strange things.
Well, this is actually it's a good introduction to another aspect of interpretation of art in terms of the creative process. Your work is figurative, and some of it is fairly purely figurative, but other pieces are more abstract, more impressionist.
That's true. Once you go back, that's what I've seen, and I would say the influence. When you think about my early years in the ballet studio, a lot of the work, whether it's figurative or abstract, has to do with movement, whether it's a dance piece or whether it's a piece like The Wave, where man is turning into an ocean wave. So there's always that element about it. But you can't ignore what's gone on in the past 100 years. There was a whole revolution in how artists viewed sculpture and painting and music and dance. What happened in the past 100 years is it expanded so that the viewer has this universe of symbols to pull upon, all coming from a personal, individual interpretation. That's why I try not to get into really interpreting my work for other people. I like to give a title that gets them going in a direction. But what I feel when I come upon one of my works is much different from somebody else. And that's right and proper. That should be the case.
You talk about the evolution of art over the centuries, and it's interesting to me if you think about music, if you think about painting, the sculpture also, the 20th century saw a lot of abstract sculpture which may lose its connection to the viewer. But in your pieces I see, I can appreciate that there's a lot of thought and a lot of meaning, that it makes me want to sit and reflect upon it as opposed to just walking past and giving it a quick glance.
Well, you see, I hate to say this about TV, since I'm on TV, but that's part of the problem of our age. Everything is quick. And a work of art is not meant to be quick. For me, a great work of art, like you say, you can sit and actually read more into the piece. And each time you go, you should be able to enjoy it more and find a certain more depth. It's not that you have to intellectualize about it. It may be just a visual pleasure. I think about that. Trying to edge society to a new understanding of what beauty really is. And beauty doesn't have to mean a pretty face. It can mean a truth, an ideal. And once again, going back to what makes a great work of art. That's what I'm interested in. I don't want to be a sculptor just to do a pretty figure. I became an artist, and I would say came to this earth and to do a great works of art. That's my job, and I take it very seriously, even though I laugh like a fool most of the time. It's when it really comes down to it, that's what I'm all about.
What are your thoughts for the next several years ahead?
Oh, next several years ahead, there's a lot of sculpture. I try. I have these plans. Right now we finished the Chesterwood show, and they've already asked me to come back. Long range. Long range, geez, I don't know if I tell you. I would really like to start a permanent sculpture park in the Berkshire area. I think that seeing how I work, and I don't really hope to achieve a lot of public monuments like French did. Have you been to the Vigeland Sculpture Park in Oslo?
I haven't, but next time I'm in Oslo.
Next time you go, it's amazing. It's one man's work, and he basically traded the city of Oslo, that he would create this park for them, and they would own all his work. Most people don't know of Vigeland's work in the country, but it's just tremendous. And I was there in '84, and I would like to create something like that.
In Stockholm, I was in Stockholm a few years ago.
The mills.
Right.
Yeah. That's on the island outside it.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
There's actually probably 1,000 islands around Stockholm.
Okay.
It's deceptive, but that's very impressive. And the hills and the waterfront and the gardens are just a tremendous setting for the works to be shown.
Well, anytime I go to, I pick up the New York Times travel section, what do they show? They show a sculpture in front of the city or something. That's how sculpture is often perceived, as being part of a place. It's wonderful that way in Europe, and it's starting more and more here in the States. You'll see it on some of the subway lines, certain pieces. Neil Stern, who was past president of the National Sculpture Society, he's got the Frank Sinatra commission that's going to go, I think, on 42nd or somewhere. I think it's Times Square, that area. It's great to see that happen. Battery Park with Tom Otterness and his works.
Westchester County,
PepsiCo, yeah, exactly.
the Ray Sculpture Garden.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
Where, for those viewers who might get lost, actually trying to drive out to...
Geez, you...
I followed the directions, but where can our viewers see your pieces?
Well, right here at the moment is the only place at the moment where I really have a large grouping of the works at the studio.
You also have a website.
I have a website, which is my name, www.andrewdevries.com, which is a good way. The great thing about websites is I could never afford to print that much information, actually put it in ink and paper at this point, where a website you can. So you can see some of the sculptures, and you can see some of the history and the process as well we put up there.
I want to thank you very much for having us visit your studio. This has been great. Thank you very much.
I'll put the armature in and then sculpt it to a degree, and then I'll take it off and start working a hand or a finger a little bit more with the heat and refining it. I think I talked about at Chesterwood how the difference of a file on a finger can make such a difference. And I'm sure most people don't see it. But in the end, the overall connection of the piece, it does make a huge difference. Even being able to take it off and viewing it from this way and this way and this way and this way, making it really three-dimensional.
While progress should never come to a halt, there are many places it should never come to at all. So we work locally with communities, businesses, and people like you to save precious places around the world forever. I'm Paul Newman. Help the Nature Conservancy save the last great places.